I start to read another story by Haruki Murakami. The title is First Person Singular. I hardly ever wear suits, at most maybe 2 or 3 times a year, since there are rarely any situations where I need to get dressed up. I may wear a casual jacket on occasion, but no tie or leather shoes. That's the type of life I choose for myself. So that's how things have worked out. Sometimes, though, even when there is no need for it, I do decide to wear a suit and a tie. Why? When I open my closet and check out what kind of clothes are there, I have to do that or else I don't know what kind of clothes I own. And the gaze at the suits I have hardly ever worn, the dress shirts still in the dry cleaner's plastic garment bags, and the ties that look brand new, no trace of ever having been used. I started to feel apologetic toward these clothes. Then I try them on just to see how they look. I experiment with various ties knots to see if I still remember how to do them, including one making a proper dimple. The only time I do all this is when I'm home alone. For someone else is here, I would have to explain what I'm up to. Once I go to the trouble of getting the outfit on, it seems a waste to take it all off right away. So I go out for a while dressed up like that, strolling around town in a suit and a tie. And it feels pretty good. I get the sense that even my facial expression and gait are transformed. It's an invigorating sensation, as if I have temporarily stepped away from the everyday. But after an hour or so of roaming, this newness fades. I get tired of wearing a suit and tie. The tie starts to feel itchy and too tight, like it's choking me. The leather shoes click too hard and loud as they strike the pavement. So I go home, slip off the leather shoes, peel off the suit and tie, change into a worn-out set of sweatpants and sweatshirt, plop down on the sofa and feel relaxed and at peace. This is my little 1-hour secret ceremony, entirely harmless, or at least not something I need to feel guilty about. I was alone in the house that day. My wife had gone out to eat Chinese food. I never eat Chinese food. I think I'm allergic to some of the spices they use. So she goes with a close girlfriend of hers whenever she has a craving. After a quick dinner, I put on an old Johnny Mitchell album and settled down in my special reading chair and read a mystery. I loved this album, and the novel was the very latest by one of my favorite authors. But for some reason, I couldn't settle down, couldn't focus on either the music or the book. I considered watching a movie I had recorded, but couldn't find one I really wanted to see. Some days are like that. You have time on your hands and you try to decide what you want to do, but cannot come up with a thing. There should have been tons of things I wanted to do. As I wandered aimlessly around the room, an idea struck me. I haven't tried on a suit in ages, so why not? I laid out a Paul Smith suit on the bed, one I had bought out of necessity, but I had only worn twice. And I picked out a tie and shirt that would go well with it. A light gray, widespread collar shirt and a Amagendo Zagna tie with an elaborate paisley pattern that I would have bought at the Rome airport. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and checked how I looked. Not bad, I concluded. At least nothing was obviously wrong with this outfit. As the reader myself, I have to stop here to make just a couple of comments. One is that Murakami claimed that he never eat Chinese food. I don't think this is a good strategy for selling his books, because if Chinese people know that he doesn't like Chinese food, probably they wouldn't want to buy his novel. That's the fact. But anyway, the second is about the English, this I had. When I read it, I don't know what words will come afterwards. So it's very difficult to read out. If I read I would, and it turns out I should have read it I had. I don't know how to deal with that. Maybe readers, you know, and tell me. Okay, let me continue. But on that particular day, as I stood in front of the mirror, an uncomfortable feeling came over me. A tinge of remorse. Remorse? How should I put it? I imagine it was like a guilty conscience someone feels who goes through life having embellished a resume. I may not be illegal, but it is a misrepresentation that raises a lot of ethical issues. You know it's wrong. You know nothing good will come of it, yet you cannot help yourself. There is a certain kind of uneasiness that those kinds of actions engender. I'm just imagining this, but it might be similar to the feeling of a man who secretly dresses up as a woman. But it is weird that I should feel this way. I have been an upstanding adult for years now. I pay what I own for my taxes on time. I have never broken the law, other than a few traffic tickets. And I might not be the most cultured person around, but I'm refined enough. I even know who was older, Petrarch or Stravinsky. I doubt a few other people do. And these clothes I had on were items I had paid for with income acquired by working every day legally, or at least not illegally. There was nothing anyone could blame me for, okay? One, then, by this guilty conscience, why this edgy feeling that ethically something was amiss? Well, everyone has days like that. I told myself. I would think even Django Reinhardt had nights when he flopped a chord or two, and Niki Lauda some afternoons when he messed up changing gears. So I decided not to think any more deeply about it. Decked out in the suit and tie, I slipped on a pair of leather cordovan shoes and went out. I should have followed my gut and stayed at home and watched movies, but that was something I only realized after the fact. It was a pleasant spring evening. A bright full moon hung in the sky, and there were young green buds just appearing on the trees lining the streets. perfect weather for a walk. I strolled around for a while, then decided to stop in a bar and have a cocktail. Not the neighborhood bar I frequented, but one a little farther away that I had never been to before. But I went to my usual bar. I could count on the bartender asking me, "White suit and necktie today. Pretty unusual get-up for you, isn't it?" It was too much trouble to explain the reason. To begin with, there wasn't any reason. It was still early evening, and I went downstairs to a basement-level bar. The only customers were two men in their 40s seated across from each other at a table. Company employees on their way home from work. By the look of it, in dark suits and forgettable ties. The two of them were leaning forward, heads close together, discussing something in low voices. There was a pile of what looked like documents of some sort on the table. Must have been going over business, I figured, or else predicting horse race results. Either way, nothing to do with me. I sit down away from them at the bar counter, choosing the stool with the best lighting, since I was planning to read, and ordered a vodka gimlet from the bow-tied, middle-aged bartender. In a little while, a chilled drink was served on a paper coaster in front of me, and I pulled out the mystery novel from my pocket and continued reading. I had about a third of the way to go to the end. As I said, it was by a writer I'm pretty fond of. But sadly, the plot of this newest book just didn't do it for me. On top of which, halfway through, I lost track of how the characters were related to each other. By the way, my listener, this is the last story, so I am about 90% of the way to go to the end. Anyway, let's continue. But I read on nevertheless, partly out of duty, partly out of habit. I have never liked giving up on a book once I have started it. I always hold out hope that there will be some riveting development toward the end, though the chances of that are pretty slim. I slowly sipped my vodka gimlet and forged ahead another 20 pages in the book. For some reason, though, I still couldn't concentrate, and it wasn't simply because the novel wasn't the most riveting. It wasn't like the bar was noisy. The background music was subdued, the lighting fine, almost a perfect atmosphere for enjoying a book. I think it was due to that vague sense of unease I had been feeling, that something just wasn't quite right, was slightly out of joint, like the contents didn't fit the container, like the integrity of it all had been lost. I get that feeling from time to time. In back of the bar was a shelf with an impressive lineup of bottles, and behind that was a large mirror in which I was reflected. I stared at it for a while, and as you might expect, the me in the mirror stared back. A sudden thought hit me, that somewhere I had taken a wrong turn in life, and the longer I stared at my image, decked out in a suit and tie, this sensation only intensified. The more I stared at my image, the more it seemed like less like me and more like someone I had never seen before. But if this isn't me in the mirror, I thought, then who is it? As is true of most people, I imagine, I had experienced a number of turning points in my life where I could go either left or right, and each time I chose one, right or left. There were times when there was a clear-cut reason, but most of the time there wasn't. And it wasn't always like I was making a choice, but more like the choices itself choose me. And now here I was, first person singular. If I had chosen a different direction, most likely I wouldn't be there. But still, who is that in the mirror? I closed my book for a moment, looked away from the mirror, and took a couple of deep breaths. The bar was starting to fill up. A woman was seated on my right, 2 empty stools away. She was drinking a pale green cocktail, but I didn't have a clue what it was called. She seemed to be alone, or maybe she was waiting for a friend to show up. I pretended to read and checked her out in the mirror. She wasn't young, probably 50 or so. She didn't seem to be making an effort to look younger than her age. She seemed pretty self-confident. She was petite and slim, her hair cut just the right length. Her clothes were pretty chic. A striped dress in a soft-looking material and a beige cashmere cardigan. She didn't have particularly beautiful features, but there was a kind of overall elegance to her. When she was a young woman, she must have been striking. Men must have always been flirting with her. I could sense memories of those days by the way she held herself. So, my listener, you can see, no one wants to read in a bar. A man goes to a bar to meet a friend, or a girlfriend, or just to look at the people. And of course, before you find a friend, you find someone interesting to talk to, then you read. And if for the whole night you don't see anyone you can talk to, you'll feel uneasy. That's it. Okay, let's continue to read. I called the bartender over, ordered a second vodka gimlet, munched on a few cashews, and went back to reading. Occasionally, I touched the knot of my tie, checking to make sure it was still neatly tied. About 15 minutes later, she was seated on the stool beside me. The bar was getting crowded, and she had slid over to accommodate some newly arrived customers. I was sure now that she was alone. Under the recessed lighting, I read on until I had only a few pages left. The story still showed no signs of picking up. "Excuse me," the woman suddenly said. I raised my head and looked at her. "You seem so into your book, but I wonder if you would mind me asking you a question." For such a petite woman, she had a low, deep voice. Not a cold voice, but certainly not one that sounded friendly or inviting. "Of course, this book isn't exactly spellbinding or anything," I said. I placed a bookmark inside the novel and shut it. "What's so enjoyable about doing things like that?" she asked. I couldn't understand what she was getting at. I twisted around to face her directly. I couldn't recall ever seeing her before. I'm not that great at remembering faces, but I was fairly certain we had never met. I would remember meeting her, for sure, if I had. She was that kind of a woman. Things like that, I repeated. All dressed up, alone at a bar, drinking a gimlet, quietly into your reading. Like before, I still had no idea what she was trying to tell me, though I could sense a kind of malice, enmity in her tone. I gazed at her, waiting for her to go on. Her face was oddly expressionless. It was like she was determined to conceal any emotion on her face. She was silent for a long time, about a minute, I would say. Vodka gimlet, I said to break the silence. What did you say? It's not a gimlet, but a vodka gimlet. A pointless remark, perhaps, but there was a difference. She gave a small, compact shake of her head, as if flating away a tiny fly buzzing around her. Whatever. But do you think that's all pretty fantastic? Urban, stylish, and smart and all? I probably should have paid my bill and left as soon as I could. That was the best reaction in a situation like this. The woman, for some reason, was picking a fight, challenging me. What compelled her to do that, I had no idea. She might have just been in a full mood, or else something about me struck her the wrong way, jangled her nerves, irritated her. The chance of anything good coming from an encounter with someone like that was next to zero. The wise choice would have been to politely excuse myself, smile, and stand up. The smile was optional. Quickly pay my bill and get as far away as I could. And I couldn't think of any reason not to. I'm not the type who cannot stand to lose, and I don't like to fight when I cannot see the justice in it. I'm more into silent, strategic withdrawals. But for whatever reason, that's not what I did. Something stopped me. Curiosity, perhaps. My dear listener, what do you think? Number one, when a woman sits beside you, and she's single, she's by herself, you have to say something, right? Out of politeness. You have to say something. So I guess even the woman wouldn't talk to Murakami. Murakami will talk to her after a little while. But then, of course, if you feel it won't be a pleasant talk, then you should go, right? But on the other hand, most people wouldn't, because it is just not polite. Okay, a woman sit by you and wanted to talk to you, whether it is out of malice or whatever, whether she's pretty or not, as long as not too bad, you wouldn't just leave her, right? I wouldn't. What do you think, my listener? Let's go back to the story. Pardon me, what are we, but are we acquainted? I ventured. She narrowed her eyes and stared at me strangely. The front lines next to her eyes deepened. Acquainted? She said, picked up her cocktail glass. This was her third drink, if her memory serves, and took a sip of whatever it was inside. What? I had no idea. Acquainted. How did you come up with that word? I searched my memory once more. Had I met this woman somewhere? The answer was no. Clearly, this was the first time I had ever laid eyes on her. I'm thinking you must be mistaking me for someone else, I said. My voice was strangely flat, expressionless. It didn't even sound like me. She smiled faintly, coldly. "Is that what you are going with?" she said, and set the thin Baccarat cocktail glass back down on the coaster in front of her. "That's a lovely suit," she said, "though it doesn't look good on you. It's like you were wearing borrowed clothes. And that tie, it doesn't exactly go with that suit. It's a little off. The tie is Italian, but the suit, I would say, is British made. You certainly know a lot about clothes." "Know a lot about clothes?" She sounded a little taken aback. Her lips parted a fraction, and she gave me a hard stare. "Do you really need to say that? That goes without saying." "Goes without saying?" I searched my mind for the people I know in the apparel industry. I only knew a handful, and all were men. None of this made any sense. Why would this go without saying? It crossed my mind to explain to her why I was wearing a suit and a tie this evening, but I thought better of it. Explaining it wouldn't blunt the attack made she was obviously in. It might, in fact, have the opposite effect, and only pour oil on what seemed to be angry flames. I drank the last drops of my vodka gimlet and quietly got down off the bar stool. This seemed like my chance to put an end to the conversation. "I think you're probably not acquainted with me," she said. I nodded. She was right. "Not directly," she went on, "though we did meet once. We didn't talk much then, so I think you're not really acquainted with me. And you were so very busy with other things then, as usual." "As usual?" "I'm a friend of a friend of yours," she said in a quietly firm tone. "This close friend of yours, this person who used to be your close friend, I should say, is quite upset with you. And I'm just as upset with you as she is. You must know what I'm talking about. Think about it. About what happened 3 years ago at the shore. About what a horrible, awful thing you did. You shouldn't be ashamed of yourself." I had had enough. I scooped up my book, only a few pages still unread, and stuck it in my jacket pocket. I had long since lost any thought of finishing it. I quickly paid my bill in cash and exited the bar. She didn't say anything more, just followed me fixedly with her eyes as I left. I never once turned around, yet I felt her intense gaze on my back until I made it upside. That sensation, like being jabbed with a long, sharp needle, penetrated the fine clothes of my Paul Smith suit to make a deep, lasting mark on my back. As I climbed the narrow staircase to ground level, I tried to gather my thoughts. How should I have responded? Should I have asked her, "What in the world are you talking about?" and demanded that she explain herself? What she had said struck me as totally unfair, something I had no memory of whatsoever. But somehow I couldn't. Why not? I think I was afraid of learning that another me, who wasn't really me, had, at a shore somewhere 3 years ago, committed a horrendous offense toward a woman, someone I probably didn't know, afraid of having her dragged out into the light, something inside me, something completely unknown to me, Rather than face this, I chose to silently get up off my stool and make my getaway, all the while submitting to a torrent of what I could only see as groundless accusations. Did I do the right thing? If the same thing happened to me again, would I act the same? But this shore she mentioned, where could it be? The word had a strange ring to it. Was it by the ocean, a lake, a river, or some other peculiar assemblage of water? 3 years ago, was I next to some sizable body of water? I couldn't recall. I couldn't even grasp when 3 years ago had occurred. Everything she said sounded so specific, but at the same time symbolic. The parts were clear, yet the whole wasn't in focus, and that very discrepancy unsettled my nerves. At any rate, the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. I tried to swallow it down, but couldn't. Tried to spit it out, but was unable to. I wanted to get angry, plain and simple. There was no reason I had to endure that kind of a preposterous experience. The way she treated me was completely unfair. Up to that moment, it had been such a pleasant, tranquil spring evening, but strangely enough, I couldn't work up any anger. For the moment, a wave of bewilderment and confusion swept over me, swept any sense of logic away. When I got to the top of the stairs and after the building, it was no longer spring, and the moon had disappeared from the sky. This was no longer the street I knew. I had never before seen the trees lining the street. Thick, slimy snakes wound themselves tightly around the trunk, like wriggling living ornaments. Their scales rustled drearily as they rubbed against the bark. The sidewalk was ankle deep in wild-tish ash, and there were faceless men and women walking along, exhaling a yellowish, sulphurous breath from deep within their throats. The air was bitterly cold, almost freezing. I turned up the collar of my suit. "You should be ashamed of yourself," the woman said. That's the end of this story. To be honest, I don't quite understand this story, but a story is a story.